Documentary disclaimer. The story presented in this documentary is not fiction. It is based entirely on my own personal experience as a landlord in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. The timeline, legal proceedings, court documents, text messages, photographs, and video recordings shown in this documentary are derived from real events. To help viewers verify the facts independently, the official case can be searched through Quebec's Tribunal administratif du logement, TAL, public records. Dossier number 959149. Property: 7280 Rue Chabot, Apartment 8. Montreal, Quebec, Canada. These records are publicly accessible and do not require a password. Some personal information has been removed or artistically reconstructed to protect privacy. This documentary is intended to document my experience and to encourage landlords to understand the importance of written agreements, proper documentation, and following legal procedures throughout the rental process. Viewers are encouraged to review the public records and draw their own conclusions based on the available evidence. The trap of the perfect tenant. Last September, a young couple in their 20s reached out to me about renting one of my smaller apartments. They had likely spotted my ad on Facebook. The unit only has one small bedroom. So the first thing I told them over the phone was straight to the point. This apartment is very small. It might feel cramped for 2 adults. The young woman quickly reassured me. We're usually at work. We only come home at night to sleep. It sounded natural. And perfectly reasonable. A few days later, they came to view the place together. They were neatly dressed, well-spoken, and looked like a young couple deeply in love. They told me they were getting married soon. They had already purchased a new condo, and were simply waiting to take possession. All they needed was a temporary place to stay for just 1 year. From a landlord's perspective, they seemed like the ultimate dream tenants. They had clear plans for their future. They owned property. They had a definitive move-out date. There appeared to be absolutely no reason for them to overstay. At least, that was what I thought at the time. I followed standard procedure and requested proof of employment, banking info, and IDs. The woman, whom we will refer to as the tenant, did not have a formal job. She said she assisted her boyfriend with his business. The man's name was Matthew. To keep things clear, let's call him Matthew P. Matthew P. explained that he wasn't traditionally employed. Instead, he made his living trading stocks. That meant he didn't have standard pay stubs. However, he provided a solid bank statement and his driver's license. Both of them submitted their IDs. She gave me her phone number, while Matthew P. provided his email address as the primary contact on the lease. During our conversation, Matthew P. casually dropped a remark. I recently bought a bed that cost more than a full year's rent for this apartment. Looking back now, that comment was a massive red flag in disguise. But back then, the message felt simple: I am swimming in cash. He even flashed his phone to show me his active trading charts. To sweeten the deal, they volunteered. If you're worried, we can pay several months' rent in advance. For a landlord trying to vet a prospective tenant, this avalanche of reassurance easily put my mind at ease. In the end, I only accepted 2 months' rent, the first and the last, and documented it clearly in the lease. But when it came time to sign, a tiny detail emerged that seemed completely insignificant at the time. I had assumed both names would go on the lease. But Matthew P. suddenly became incredibly courteous. He kept insisting. Just put her name on it. He made it look like he was simply being a gentleman, leaving the final decision to his future wife. It didn't strike me as odd. It's not unusual for a couple to live together with only one person on the paperwork. So, only her name went on the lease. And yet, Matthew P. was the one who had provided the financial backing. His email was on the contract. His driver's license was in my files. In my head, all these pieces were connected. I never could have imagined that a few months later, this one tiny detail would become my worst nightmare. After they moved in, everything seemed fine at first. Sometimes the rent was slightly delayed, but I'd send a quick text, they'd offer a polite excuse, and the money would arrive. I didn't see these minor delays as a warning. The real turning point came in March of the following year. March, the sudden disappearance. On March 10th, I noticed the rent still hadn't been deposited. I sent the female tenant a text message. There was no reply. On March 12th, I texted her again. This time, she finally responded. She claimed they were currently out of the country and experiencing a temporary issue with their bank account. She said they needed to return to Canada to resolve it in person, writing, "We will be back by next week." I suddenly recalled that during our initial meeting, they had indeed mentioned a planned trip to the Philippines in March. So I gave her the benefit of the doubt. I waited 1 week. Then I waited another. On March 23rd, I followed up again. This time, she promised she would clear the balance by paying 2 months' rent together. And then, she vanished. After March 23rd, it was as if she had evaporated from the face of the earth. No replies to my texts. No answers to my calls. No explanation. No rent. Just a deafening silence. April, the bureaucratic nightmare begins. I couldn't afford to wait forever. On April 3rd, I formally filed an application through the online portal of the Tribunal administratif du logement, the TAL. But in reality, clicking submit online does not mean your case instantly begins. So I waited again. It wasn't until April 7th that a case number was finally generated. The moment I received it, I hired a bailiff to formally serve the legal documents. I paid the fees. The bailiff delivered the papers. On paper, the legal machine was moving forward, one agonizing step at a time. But a few days later, I discovered that the official documents served by the bailiff had been casually thrown onto the ground. At that precise moment, a profound sense of absurdity washed over me. On my side, I was meticulously following every single rule dictated by the system. Filling out endless forms. Waiting. Securely obtaining a case number. Hiring a bailiff. Paying out-of-pocket fees. Ensuring proper service. Yet, on the other side, someone could simply ignore my texts. Ignore my calls. Refuse to pay rent. They could even throw official court documents onto the dirt, completely unfazed. And all the system allowed me to do was wait. March turned into April. April bled into May. The mortgage payments didn't stop. The property taxes didn't stop. The insurance premiums didn't stop. None of my responsibilities as a property owner paused for a single second. Only one thing stopped, the rent. May 10th, stopping the bleeding. By May 10th, I reached my breaking point. I changed the locks. I am fully aware that this is the most controversial step in this entire ordeal. But I want to explain exactly why I was driven to do it. Since March 23rd, I had heard absolutely nothing. No communication, no answers, no payments. Meanwhile, the TAL process was crawling forward at a painfully slow, bureaucratic pace. My financial losses were compounding month after month. At that moment, I had only one single thought. I have to stop the bleeding. So on May 10th, I took matters into my own hands. I changed the locks. May 12th, late at night, the world turned upside down. 2 days later. May 12th, deep into the night. The tenant, who had been an unreachable ghost for months, suddenly materialized. She discovered her key no longer fit the lock. Instinctively, she called emergency services. I rushed to the property in the dead of night, genuinely believing this was my chance to explain reality to law enforcement. I was ready to tell them, she hasn't paid rent in months. I have an active TAL case. A bailiff has already served her. She severed all communication. I was simply protecting my property from further ruin. But reality hit me like a brick wall. The responding officers didn't want to hear my story. Instead, they shouted at me and forcefully slammed me into handcuffs. In a matter of seconds, I went from being a victimized landlord trying to recover my stolen rent, to a criminal being detained on my own property. To make matters worse, the police confiscated my phone. Later, a random passerby found it discarded on the pavement. The screen was completely obliterated. For the full story on that, please watch my other video. As an update on the phone incident, I have since filed official complaints with both the Montreal Police Department, SPVM, and the Quebec Police Ethics Commissioner's Office. I have also submitted a formal financial claim to the City of Montreal. But what about the original nightmare that sparked it all that night? Not a single dollar was resolved. The unpaid rent remained stolen. The TAL case remained gridlocked in the system. And I was left with no choice but to go back to doing what the law demands, wait. That night, a profoundly disturbing realization sank in. A lease is supposed to be a legally binding contract that holds both sides accountable. The tenant promises to pay, the landlord promises to maintain a home. But when a tenant completely stops fulfilling their obligations, it feels as though they have ripped that contract to shreds. Yet, the law forces the landlord to hold on to those worthless pieces. The other party's total breach of contract does not excuse you from a single legal obligation. You must still follow every agonizing protocol. You must still wait. And if you dare to take a standalone action to protect your life savings, an action the law doesn't expressly authorize, the system will crush you instantly. Before becoming a landlord, I had never experienced a dynamic so fundamentally broken and unjust. June 8th, the legal showdown. And so, the waiting continued. Until June 8th at precisely 2:30 p.m. I finally stepped into the TAL hearing room. Just think about that timeline: March, April, May, June. By the time I finally sat across from the adjudicator, 4 agonizing months of my life and money had already been swallowed by this dispute. The tenant showed up. Faced with the judge, she casually admitted she owed the money. But Matthew P. He was a no-show. And that was when the tribunal confirmed a devastating truth: Matthew P. was not a party to the lease. Even though he was the one who provided the bank statements, even though his email was listed as the primary contact, and even though he pulled all the strings from day one, none of it mattered. Legally, he carried absolutely zero financial responsibility for the unpaid rent. He had orchestrated the perfect escape hatch. At that precise moment, his voice from months ago echoed in my mind back when we signed the lease. Just put her name on it. The trap had been set from the very beginning. In the courtroom, the tenant admitted she owed rent, but audaciously claimed I was still withholding a month's deposit. In the end, the tribunal saw through it. The adjudicator ordered her to pay 3 months of arrears, plus interest, a $92 Canadian filing fee, and $27 Canadian in service costs. In reality, I had paid the bailiff roughly $130 Canadian for that service. The system doesn't even fully reimburse your losses. Crucially, the adjudicator ordered the immediate termination of the lease and her eviction. On paper, it sounded like a victory. The nightmare should have ended there, right? Wrong. There was a venomous twist. On May 12th, the police had told her that because I changed the locks, she had the right to pursue criminal charges against me. She weaponized this during the hearing. Fortunately, the adjudicator shut her down, stating today's focus was unpaid rent. If she wanted to sue me, she'd have to open a separate case. I also brought up the missing keys to the old lock. The adjudicator confronted her. Why are you holding onto a key that is useless to you? The judge repeatedly warned her, if she wanted to stop the eviction, she had to clear the entire balance before the formal judgment was issued, which was expected in 2 weeks. After the hearing adjourned, I followed her outside to retrieve the old key. And there he was, Matthew P. He hadn't set foot in the courtroom, but he had been lurking outside the entire time. In a final stroke of irony, it was Matthew P. who handed me the key. He looked me in the eye and assured me, as soon as we get the judgment, I'll e-transfer the money. For a fleeting second, I believed him. I thought the nightmare was finally over. But right beside him, the tenant was frantically signaling him with her eyes. That was the last time I ever saw Matthew P. in person. But the name Matthew would continue to haunt this story. The judgment arrived, but my property did not. The waiting resumed. The judgment was officially issued around June 23rd, but it took another 20 agonizing days for the physical copy to arrive in my mailbox. I later discovered TAL judgments can be downloaded online, but when I contacted a bailiff to begin enforcement, he flatly refused the digital copy. He demanded a scanned version of the official paper judgment. I had won the lawsuit. The law was on my side. Yet my apartment was still not mine. That was the moment I truly understood a bitter truth: winning a judgment and enforcing it are 2 completely different universes. A TAL judgment carries zero inherent deterrent for a professional squatter. They can simply refuse to move, and there is nothing you can do without launching yet another legal battle. The bailiff advised me that some tenants do pack up voluntarily once they receive the paper judgment. If she left on her own, I could avoid another massive enforcement fee. So, against my better judgment, I gave her one last chance. She swore she only needed one final night. She promised that the next morning, at 11 a.m. sharp, she would empty the apartment, vacate the premises, and hand over the keys. That day was July 10th. July 10th, the final illusion. I arrived early that morning. I parked outside, watching the building. I had completely renovated this unit right before they moved in. I was paranoid that they would trash the place out of spite on their way out. Full of anxiety, I walked up the stairs. I stood before my own door. And I knocked. The door opened. My heart sank. The person who answered was not my tenant. She was a woman of African descent whom I had never seen before in my life. I had no idea who she was, and I certainly had no idea why she was living inside my property. To make matters worse, we didn't even speak the same language. Panic rising, I contacted emergency services. The dispatcher routinely told me that an available officer would be sent. I begged them to hurry, but the dispatcher coldly replied that my situation was not an emergency. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang from an unknown number. It was a female police officer. She flatly informed me that the police would not be coming, stating that rental disputes fell strictly outside their jurisdiction. Left with no other choice, I opened a translation app on my phone, trying desperately to breach the language barrier. I asked her point blank, "How did you come to be living here?" She explained that her husband had a key, and he was the one who had allowed her to stay. I asked, "What is your husband's name?" She looked at me and replied, "Matthew Smith." I froze. Matthew. Another Matthew. The man who had originally applied for this apartment, the one who had handed me his driver's license and financial statements, was Matthew P. Now this total stranger was standing in my apartment, telling me her husband was Matthew S. Right in front of me, she opened Facebook Messenger to contact an account under the name Matthew Smith. A notification popped up on her screen in French, "Je suis là dans 10 minutes." "I'll be there in 10 minutes. She assured me her husband would arrive shortly, that he had a key, and that he would handle the situation. So I waited. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. But Matthew S. never materialized. The person who finally walked through the door instead was my original female tenant. Let me be absolutely clear about one thing. Are Matthew S. and Matthew P. the exact same person? I don't know. I have no concrete evidence, so I will not draw any conclusions. I can only present the facts. During the rental application, the ID I vetted belonged to Matthew P. But on July 10th, this unfamiliar woman personally told me her husband's name was Matthew S., backed by a messenger account reading Matthew Smith. As for the true relationship between those two identities, it remains a shadow. After the tenant arrived, the two women actually began packing up some of their belongings. For a fleeting moment, I thought this nightmare was finally ending. But then, she flipped the script again. She refused to leave. The previous day, she had pleaded for just one more night. Now, she stood her ground, repeatedly demanding to know if I possessed the formal, court-certified eviction enforcement documents. She kept making frantic phone calls. She was back in constant contact with Matthew. I couldn't see the face on the other end of the line, so I couldn't verify which Matthew it was. But that name, like an inescapable ghost, had once again taken over my story. After a few minutes, the tenant put the call on speakerphone. That familiar voice boomed through the speaker. With shocking arrogance, he told me to just let her leave because they were going to go have breakfast. I looked at the phone, and I replied flatly, "This is not my business." The tenant's eyes flared, and she immediately threatened to call the police. I looked right at her and said, "Go ahead. I want everyone in Montreal to know." She actually smirked and sneered at me, "Tonight, you're going to sleep in jail." The way she spoke, it was as if the police were her personal bodyguards, waiting on her hand and foot. And in the end, she really did call emergency services. 2 officers from the SPVM arrived almost instantly, 1 man, 1 woman. The male officer took her aside, while the female officer began questioning me. But here lies the most infuriating detail of that entire morning. I had already called the police hours earlier, the exact moment I discovered a complete stranger living in my apartment. Back then, the dispatcher coldly dismissed me, claiming it was a civil matter and flatly refusing to send anyone. Yet, when the tenant called, they rushed to the scene. I looked at the female officer and demanded answers. "When I called this morning, you told me it was a civil matter. Why are you here now because she called?" The officer looked at me and replied, "Because she reported an act of conflict." That day, I learned a bitter lesson about the system that no one had ever taught me before. I patiently explained the TAL judgment to the female officer. I showed her that the judgment had been issued, the rent was stolen, and the lease was legally terminated. I explained that the only reason I was standing there was that the tenant herself had promised to vacate and hand over the keys. But the harsh reality of Canadian law clapped back. The police informed me that they have zero authority to enforce a rental judgment on a landlord's behalf. Their only job was to keep the peace and prevent the dispute from escalating. Eventually, everyone walked away. And I still did not get my apartment back. July 13th, no more second chances. July 10th was a Friday. I had no choice but to swallow my anger and wait out yet another agonizing weekend. Then came Monday, July 13th. I called the bailiff immediately. I was done relying on hollow promises from professional grifters. The bailiff instantly initiated the formal eviction enforcement process. I reached into my pocket and paid another $360 Canadian. The enforcement order was stamped on July 14th. But even with those papers in hand, the system protects the squatter. The law mandates a mandatory 5-day waiting period. If after those 5 days, she was still sitting inside my property saying, "I'm not leaving," the bailiff would have to physically show up with moving trucks to throw her out. And every single step would cost me more out-of-pocket fees. Feeling the legal noose tightening, she finally cracked. She texted me, "I'll move out on July 19th. I demanded a specific time, 11 a.m. sharp. She agreed. July 19th, the final day. On the morning of July 19th, I wasn't about to take any chances. By 9:30 a.m., a friend and I were already stationed outside the building, watching. 10 a.m. passed. 10:30 a.m. passed. 11 a.m. arrived. Dead silence. No sign of her. No phone call. And no keys. As we stood there trapped in a state of hyper-anxiety, a tenant from a neighboring building cautiously approached us. He had witnessed the explosive dispute when the SPVM police flooded the street back on July 10th. At the time, he hadn't understood what was happening. I turned to him, and I began to explain the entire, unbelievable truth. That day, he noticed my friend and me waiting outside for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he walked over and told me. "I saw them moving their things out late last night." I thanked him. My friend and I walked up to the apartment door. He pulled out his phone and pressed record. I knocked. Silence. No one answered. But then, the door slowly swung open on its own. After fleeing with their belongings, they hadn't even bothered to lock the door. The apartment was stripped bare, completely empty except for a lone IKEA bed frame, and a few scattered remnants. We filmed every single corner. Once the condition of the property was documented, I turned the key. On July 19th, I finally locked the door to my own apartment again. From March to July, 5 full calendar months. In the end, the TAL ruled in my favor. But did I really win? The asymmetry of the system is sickening. After the tenant stopped paying, she could ghost my messages, reject my calls, and throw official court papers into the dirt. And what about me? Even when the other party shattered the lease, I was legally bound to respect it. She was allowed to tear our contract to shreds, while I was forced by law to guard those worthless pieces and walk through every agonizing step of the process. File the case. Wait. Serve the papers. Wait. Attend the hearing. Wait. Receive the judgment. Wait again. And finally, drain even more of my own money just to have that piece of paper enforced. March. April. May. June. July. 5 months of my life evaporated. I lost approximately 4 months of rental income, on top of paying at least $582 Canadian in procedural and bailiff fees. So the final question I want to ask isn't about the dry wording of the law. I simply want to ask the most ordinary, human question. Is delayed justice still justice? Does a court judgment truly deliver fairness if it cannot be turned into reality in time? My answer is no. Because by the time your justice finally arrives, the damage has already been done. The story I just shared is not fiction, it is a true story from my own life. If you want to verify the facts, you can search dossier number 959149 on the official TAL website. The property is located at 7280 Chabot, Apartment 8 Montreal, H2E2K8. This is a matter of public record, no password required. These individuals are still active on Facebook. They are professionals at exploiting legal loopholes and weaponizing the police against property owners. I am sharing this so that other landlords can stay vigilant. Please, watch out for these individuals and do not fall into the same trap I did. Thanks for watching.